Hello and welcome to week 2, Tuesday, November 3rd, our session's lessons from the Holocaust. We're glad all of you are joining us today. Today's topic is challenges of emigration and immigration. The session today will be taught by Kristin Thompson. We're happy that she is continuing to inform us and lend her expertise to these sessions with us. As always, please remember if you have any questions to put them in the chat. And we are also posting some upcoming programs, and I can cover them at the end of the session as reminders. But if you want to open up your chat, you'll see that there are a couple postings there. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Kristin Thompson.
Thanks so much, Laura. Hello, everybody. It's great to have you with us again today, or if you're new, welcome for the first time. Today, we're going to be talking about the challenges of escape, what it was for immigration restrictions and emigration, and what exactly that meant. So a question that I would get quite often when I was teaching in the classroom or when I was working at the museum, and it's a very valid question, I think, people would often ask, well, why didn't they just leave? When things got so bad, especially after Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, why didn't the Jewish people just leave? So it's a common question. It's a pretty simple question, and yet the answer is very complex, as you're going to see today when we go through what this entire process looked like. As we've covered in previous sessions, through hundreds of legal measures, the Nazi-led German government was gradually excluding Jewish people from the public life, different professions, public education. So that was one of the entities that affected this as well, about why didn't they just leave? And of course, the goal of Nazi propaganda was to demonize Jewish people and create a climate of hostility and indifference towards their plight. And on Kristallnacht, or the night of broken glass, in November of '38, the Jewish businesses and the synagogues were destroyed in the first act of state-sponsored violence against the Jewish community. And again, when we think about the museum's definition of the Holocaust, that it was state-sponsored, that it was systematic, that it was bureaucratic, this is violence against the Jewish community that is sponsored by the government. So many Jews who had the means tried to leave Germany, but they encountered countless bureaucratic hurdles, as you're going to see as we go through the process today. So again, very complex answer to what seems like a very simple question that people often ask. As our introduction today, and to give a little bit more information about Kristallnacht, which was obviously a pivotal event during the Holocaust, we're going to watch the next chapter of The Path to Nazi Genocide. We watched the first 2 chapters last week, and so this chapter today is From Citizens to Outcasts. It's about 7 minutes long, and like I said, it'll be a good introduction for today's session, and then we'll jump into the process of what it was like to try to emigrate out of Germany and immigrate into the US.
Before the Nazis assumed power, Jews enjoyed all rights of citizenship in Germany. After 1933, the German government gradually excluded Jews from public life and public education. Newly established Jewish private schools provided a safe learning environment for some. By 1938, German authorities had isolated and segregated Germany's Jews, expelling them from the professions and eliminating most opportunities to earn a living.
We felt so, why can't we be part of it? Why can't we? Everybody said Heil Hitler like this. I did too. What did I know? I was 8 years old. So my mother said to me, you're not supposed to do that. I said, why not? She said, haven't you been told that you were Jewish? I said, oh, I forgot.
Germany's Jews would get plenty of reminders.
Meine Herrschaften, hier ist Bankrott in jüdischen Warenhäusern. Gehen Sie doch bitte weiter.
This sense of isolation that came upon us after 1933, gradual and increasing. It also affected us psychologically. We knew we were in a hostile world.
Between 1933 and 1939, the German government enacted hundreds of laws to define, segregate, and impoverish German Jews.
My sister and I used to slink by those huge banners that were all over the city, and we used to just try not to see them, thinking if we didn't see them, they weren't there. But they were there. That just little by little, that really took over.
Wer selig geworden ist, der weiß, ohne Lösung der Judenfrage keine Erlösung der Menschheit.
The goal of Nazi propaganda was to demonize Jews and encourage Germans to see Jews as dangerous outsiders in their midst. After 1935, everyday anti-Semitism was a regular part of carnival parades and floats. Public displays of anti-Semitism reinforced a climate of hostility toward Jews in Germany, or at the least, indifference to their treatment. In March 1938, German troops moved into neighboring Austria. Germany shredded another provision of the Versailles Treaty as Hitler's homeland was incorporated into Germany. It was a disaster for Austrian Jews. Within a year, the Nazis achieved in Austria what had taken 5 years to carry out in Germany. On November 9th, the Nazi Party orchestrated an outbreak of anti-Jewish violence throughout Greater Germany. It was a lawless onslaught that outraged the world and provoked criticism of the regime by many Germans. Jewish businesses that had already suffered anti-Semitic attacks were targeted for deliberate vandalism disguised as spontaneous public action. Party officials directed the SA, SS, and Hitler Youth to destroy Jewish shops and torch synagogues. Over 7,000 Jewish-owned businesses were vandalized. Germans named the violent attacks Kristallnacht, Night of Broken Glass, for the shattered windows of Jewish-owned stores that littered the streets. The nationwide violence damaged or destroyed more than 250 synagogues.
After Kristallnacht, I remember driving through Berlin and seeing the synagogues in flames and all the glass on the streets and the people huddled and depressed. They walked around like the victims, like the hunted.
German police filled the concentration camps with thousands of Jewish inmates. The SS released them only if they agreed to emigrate. But Jews faced increasingly restrictive immigration quotas in most countries and bureaucratic hurdles in Germany. A new law, issued in October 1938, required Jews to surrender their old passports, which would be valid only after the letter J was stamped on them. 2 months later, another law prevented the flight of capital owned by Jews when the economics ministry froze all Jewish property and assets. Many, who had the means and somewhere to go, tried to leave Germany. Some families sent their children alone to other, safer countries. They could not know how soon the world would be at war.
So I think that's a good introduction for our session today on the challenges of escape. So in the late 1930s, Hundreds of thousands of European Jews had applied to immigrate to the United States. Unlike today, however, there was no special provision for people fleeing persecution to be labeled as a refugee rather than simply wanting to immigrate for other reasons. European Jews had to follow the difficult US immigration process, and there were other countries that they tried to flee to as well. And each country had a little bit different requirements of what it would take in order to immigrate, which also complicated the system as well. But the process would take a great deal of time as well as a great deal of paperwork. And the picture that you see here are some refugees who are lined up outside the American Consulate in Marseille, France. So just a quick overview of all of the steps involved. You look at this and you think, wow, that's a lot. And each step actually has some subcategories and sub-steps within them. And again, this is at a time when the laws against the Jewish people continue to increase. The violence continues to increase. The war is going on. So to gather up all these documents and follow this bureaucratic red tape would be enough of a challenge in ordinary times. But given the fact that all the other entities are going on with the events of the Holocaust and the increase in violence, the war, made it that much more difficult. And of course, we're talking about people's, this is a matter of life and death for them to get out. So step one is to apply for a waiting list. Step two, you need to go through and get all kinds of documents. We're going to go in depth in that in just a moment. Step three, you have to find an American sponsor. Then you have to buy your ship ticket, collect a transit visa, or multiple variations of that. Then you finally have an interview with the US Consulate. And if you've managed to accomplish all of this, step seven, you finally receive that US immigration visa and your journey to the US begins. So step one, in the 1920s, Congress had passed what basically amounted to a very racist law that set a yearly limit on the people born in each country who could immigrate to the United States. The law prioritized immigration that was going to be from a country with a large white Protestant population. Between 1938 and 1941, the US law was only allowing 27,370 immigration visas per year to be issued to people in Germany or Austria. If you wanted to present your paperwork and be interviewed by the US Consulate in the hope of getting a visa, you needed to register to join the waiting list. And by 1938, you could expect to wait for at least 2 years for that visa. And again, time is of the essence for people to try to get out because it is a matter of life and death. The registration application for the waiting list, on the left, we have a translation of the original document that you see over on the right. So this one is from September 1938, so it's just before Kristallnacht. Kristallnacht, again, Night of Broken Glass, takes place in November of 38. It's from the American General Consulate in Berlin, and it says that it hereby informs you that you're registered on the Germany waiting list under the following numbers: 45,685, and then 86. So this was a couple, and so they have subsequent or concurrent numbers. So that's why you see the 86 down below there. And at the bottom of the document, it says, it cannot currently be stated when you can expect your case to be reviewed. However, you will receive further notification regarding this matter in good time. Well, if any of you have dealt with, government bureaucracy, you know that that kind of language is not going to instill a lot of hope and faith in you that this bureaucratic red tape could be ongoing for quite some time. And again, when people are desperately trying to get out, the fact that, we'll get back to you in a matter of good time doesn't exactly help much. Not very reassuring. While you're on this waiting list, you would be gathering up all the documents that you're going to need in order to be ready when your turn finally does come up. So in order to get the documents, though, you have to go to several different government offices, and typically there's going to be a fee that they're going to obtain for each one of these documents that you need. Some of them also had expiration dates, and so you might have to renew them, and you might have to renew them more than once. So it's also this balancing act of making sure that you have the proper documentation, at the right time to make sure that when you finally do get called for your interview, everything is in order. And if some of the expiration dates come and go, then you have to start over again and start gathering some of the documents all over. So collecting the documents for the visa application, they want 5 copies of this. Birth certificate, you need 2 copies. You're going to need a medical clearance, a police certificate of good conduct, a tax document, a military discharge, and an inventory list. I think this quote on the bottom here from American journalist Kristin Thompson sums it up very well. She says, "It is a fantastic commentary on the inhumanity of our times that for thousands and thousands of people, a piece of paper with a stamp on it is the difference between life and death." And all that paperwork that you see in the background there are documents that were given to the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. And as part of their new exhibit, Americans and the Holocaust. And a colleague of mine, Becky Belding, is going to be with us on Friday to talk about that exhibit and go more into depth on that particular angle of it. So the visa application is basically just providing U.S. officials with some basic information about the applicant. So things like your name, birth date, parents' names, address. It just helps them learn about the potential immigrant's identity and background. But again, you're going to need to fill that one out so that they have 5 copies of it. Then you need to collect your medical clearance. So potential immigrants have to be examined by a U.S. government-approved doctor. Officials feared that people with certain diseases might spread the diseases once they immigrated to the U.S., or if they had a disability, maybe they wouldn't be able to support themselves in the U.S. So this document belonged to 16-year-old Joanna Landman. She received her note from her doctor stating that she had no serious medical conditions that would prevent her from being able to support herself in the U.S. And this was in June of 38. Basically just has her name, her birth date, her address, and the doctor says she is bodily and mentally healthy and free from communicable diseases. So she would need to keep this with her and present this at the consulate during her interview. Then you also need a police certificate of good conduct. And if you were with us yesterday when Sarah presented about law enforcement and conformity, and we talked about the police, this could be a difficult piece of paper to try and acquire. The police, many of them were now collaborating with the Nazis. Their authority had been greatly increased, which allowed them to arrest people without cause and hold them for as long as they like. So in order to get this piece of paper, you were really at the mercy and the whim of the individual that you went to get this, the chief of your particular police department. Some might be willing to give this to you, but they might also tack on an extra fee or bribery. And keep in mind that at this point, your possessions may have already been confiscated because you're Jewish. You might not be allowed to work if you were in some of those first professions, especially where the Jewish people were kicked out in 1933. You also had to pay taxes on all of your possessions, and you're trying to save up money to buy this ship ticket to get out of Nazi Germany. So having to tack on extra fees for bribing police officers was not something that maybe would have been easy for people either. But the US immigration officials required this certificate from the German police, stating that the potential immigrant was not a criminal. This particular document belonged to Dr. Ernst Bernhardt, and he received the certificate from the Berlin Police Department, attesting that he did not have a criminal record. He had actually traveled to the US on a visitor's visa in late October of 1938. And to prove that he would return, he left his wife, Ella, behind, which seems a little strange that that's supposed to be your proof that you're going to return. But after Kristallnacht takes place the next month, President Roosevelt allowed Germans who were in the United States on a visitor's visa to remain indefinitely. So Dr. Bernhardt did not return to Germany. And in late 1940, he was able to bring his wife, Ella, over to the US to join him. You also needed a tax document. So prior to immigration to the US, that's where this particular person is from, 25-year-old Nella Weissman obtained this document from the Nazi German tax office, indicating that she had indeed paid her taxes. And again, there are stamps on here that, show August of 1938 in Vienna. And it says that I have no objections, and then it would have the signature of the official. In addition to needing tax documents to immigrate or to go to the US, you also had tax documents that were required on the Nazi German side, so in order to emigrate or to leave. So the certificate that you needed from the Reich Ministry of Finance included all of these different elements of it. There was a payment of an emigration tax or a departure tax of 25% on your total assets valued at more than 50,000 Reichmarks. And this tax was going to come due upon the dissolution of your German residence. So when you're ready to leave and board your ship, you have to pay this tax. There was also a submission of an itemized list that you had to provide of all gifts made to third parties since January 1st, 1931. If their value exceeded 10,000 Reichmarks, then they were included in the calculation of that emigration tax. You also had to make a payment of a capital transfer tax, again, 25%, and this was only levied on Jewish people of any assets in addition to the emigration tax. And then you needed that certification from the local tax office that there were no outstanding taxes due before you can leave. And you also needed certification from a currency exchange office that all of the currency regulations had been followed. An immigrant was permitted to take only 2,000 Reichmarks or less in currency out of the country. And any remaining assets would be transferred into blocked bank accounts with restricted access. So basically you're forfeiting the rest of your money to the German government in order to be allowed to leave. You also had to have an inventory list for the US side. So you not only had to tell Nazi Germany what you're taking with you and you had to pay this tax on it, you also had to let the US know what exactly you're bringing with you. So, and again, you're gonna have to pay this large tax in Germany. The list had to be incredibly inclusive down to things like pillowcases on here. So here we have the inventory list for the Winter family, and we're gonna have a few more documents about them and we'll get into their family story in just a little bit. But on here, they also have some stamps from the freight furniture company, et cetera, that had to help provide some proof of these items that they were wanting to take with them or that they owned. And you also had to fill out a customs declaration. And again, this was part of the emigration or the policy to leave Nazi Germany. And this had to be dated no earlier than 3 days before you're planning to depart, permitting the export of itemized personal and household goods. So you have to submit your list, again in triplicate, of all of the personal and household goods accompanying you and stating their value. The list had to note items acquired before January 1st of 1933, those acquired since January 1st of 1933, and those acquired simply to facilitate your emigration process. You had to have documents attesting to the value of personal and household goods, and you had to have written explanations for the necessity of taking them out of the country. And even though you're providing this documentation about why you think you should bring these items with you, maybe they were, personal mementos and they had great family meaning to you, that might not pass the test of the Nazis allowing you to take it with you, but they did require that you have that written explanation. And again, you needed certification from a currency exchange office permitting the export of the itemized personal and household goods. And that had to be dated no earlier than 14 days before departure. If you're getting a headache yet from these lists and how many days before and after, you can only begin to imagine what people actually going through this must have been feeling and going through. So now that you've collected all of these different documents and you've paid attention to the dates on them, et cetera, you've paid fees for those documents, well, now you need to find yourself an American sponsor. Preferably, this would be a relative, since Nazi Germany only allowed Jews to emigrate with a small amount of money and property. It's probably going to be easier for a distant relative to help you out with financial needs when you reach the US before maybe you're able to find a job. And so this sponsor had to collect and also send documents promising that they're going to take responsibility for you after you arrive in the US. Because of the Great Depression, the US required proof that potential immigrants would not become what they called a public charge, that he or she would not need financial support after arriving in the US. And of course, you're likely going to be communicating with this person, trying to find somebody to sponsor you by sending letters back and forth. And so of course, that also is going to take time, probably a couple of weeks for the letter to reach the US, a couple of weeks for it to go back. And then if you need further communication, all of that is going to delay this process some more. You know, we think about how difficult it is today if you need to get some sort of government issued documents, et cetera. But we have the internet, and it's so much easier now that we can email things. And of course, these folks didn't have that sort of luxury. So we're talking about communicating in very old-fashioned ways that are going to be very, very time dependent. And then after September of 1940, the US government then requires you to have 2 of these sponsors. So it's hard enough to find one person who's willing to go out on a limb and try to help you, especially after the depression's been going on and jobs are scarce in the US, people are not very well off. And so now you need not only one person to say that they would help support you, you need a second sponsor just in case something happens with that first sponsor and they're not able to facilitate this for you any longer. The letter that you see over here is from the Fager brothers in Vienna. And they wrote to somebody that just happened to have the same last name, the same surname, and was living in Pennsylvania. And this was fairly common. People would try to write a letter to somebody that they found that has the same last name in the hopes that maybe there would be a family connection there, or at least because they shared the same name, maybe there would be some extra sympathy or empathy in the hope that maybe they're actually related and would be willing to support this person. The family wasn't really sure if this George Fager, who lived in Pennsylvania, was actually a family member or not, but they hoped that he would assist them. And the letter reads, I'll read it to you, it's a little bit hard to read just because it's small type over there, but it's dated on December 29th, 1938. So this is a month after Kristallnacht. And you'll notice on the top for the home address, it says Vienna, Germany. So Austria has already been annexed by Germany. They've become part of the German Empire at this point. So Vienna, which we would think of as Austria, now belongs to Germany. So a lot of the documents that you're going to see today are from Vienna, and they will all say Vienna-Germany. So the letter reads, above all, I have to apologize for intruding upon you without having the privilege of knowing you personally. But being in a sore plight, I take heart in applying to you to help me and my brothers. As we are Jews, we are forced to leave Germany, and as soon as possible, we would like to emigrate to USA. I suppose you are a relative of ours, and so I dare to ask your help by sending affidavits for me and my brother. I beg to inform you that I am engineer mechanician, probably mechanic is what he meant, engineer mechanic. My brother Bernhard is a shoe manufacturing professional, and my youngest brother Norbert, who was a barrister, that would have been a lawyer, before the change here. And of course, he's referring to that civil service law where Jews are forbidden to practice law, April 7th, 1933. So he was a lawyer, but he's also an expert in the shoe trade. On account of these facts, I hope that we will soon find a job so that no charge or obligation would arise from the affidavit to you. If it be impossible to you to send affidavits for all of us, I beg you to do your best for 1 or 2 of us and to aid us in finding benefactors who would procure the other ones. For your kind help, as well as for a soon and favorable reply, we'd be much obliged. Yours faithfully, Jacques Leo Fager from Vienna, Germany. And you can see that there's a few in here and there grammatical errors. However, you know, when they're trying to speak a different language, many of them were fairly fluent in English anyway, but still there are going to be a few catches like that. But if you think about yourself trying to write a letter to somebody else in a different language, there were some examples too where people had been putting ads in the newspapers asking for an undertaker, thinking that, you know, you would undertake the care of somebody else, not realizing what that really meant was somebody who worked, you know, in a funeral home. And so again, the language barriers could also pose a problem when you're trying to find this American sponsor. But so these 3 brothers, it's interesting the language that they're using, where they're sort of begging and pleading, and they would only do this because lives are at stake. And they also, you know, tell him what their professions are, that they have trade and an education, so that hopefully they won't become some sort of burden to this sponsor when they come to the US. Well, unfortunately, for the gentleman who wrote this letter, Jacques, help did not come in time. He was deported to Auschwitz in 1942, where he died there in September of 42. The brother Bernhard, we don't actually have a record of what happened to him, but Norbert, the youngest one who was the lawyer before he had to be pulled out of that profession, he did manage to get out with his wife, Annie. They appear on a refugee register list for Great Britain. And so again, we're not entirely sure of what exactly happened and if this gentleman, George Fager in Pennsylvania, maybe referred them to somebody else who could help in Great Britain because he couldn't, because they did get a letter back from George, but part of that letter is missing. So even though we have a great deal of information on so many of the people and what their experience was during the Holocaust, there are still unknown facts that are out there as well and missing parts of family history. The Winter family. One second here, guys. The Winter family, we're going to see a few more documents from them as well. They were able to find a sponsor. In order to improve her English, Mary Ann Winter began a pen pal program with a girl in Reading, Pennsylvania by the name of Jane Bomberger. And it was through this international pen pal project that they came to know one another, and they started corresponding in 1935. Up on top is Mary Ann when she was a young child. And the down below that is Anne and Jane. And then that's Mary Ann's family, her brother and her two parents. Well, after the Nazi annexation of Austria in 1938, the Winter family started to look for ways to get out from Great. And so Mary Ann asked Jane in one of their pen pal letters for help. And Jane's father, Joseph Bomberger, immediately agreed to sponsor the family. So the Winters left Vienna for Prague in 1938, and they left Europe from Genoa, Italy in January of 1939. Upon arrival in the US, they moved to Reading, Pennsylvania to be near the family who were sponsoring them. And then Max Winter, Mary Ann's father, began trying to send help to get his own father out of Austria, but he was not successful. So Max's father was deported to Terezin in 1942, where he died. Max had a brother who fled from Vienna, and he survived by getting to Shanghai. So people went to many different places, were really willing to go anywhere if they could just get out. So just like within step 2 of needing to collect all of those documents, within step 3, once you've found that American sponsor, they have several steps that they need to go through as well. They're going to have to collect documents and turn those in addition to your own documents that you would need. So there needs to be a recommendation letter, a bank letter, tax returns, and then this affidavit. So again, being able to find somebody who was willing to provide all of this help and again, jump through all of these bureaucratic hoops to help potentially strangers was really quite something that as many people found sponsors as actually did. The recommendation letter that you see over there on the left is for Herman Fischer. He owned a popular German restaurant in Detroit, and he asked a friend who worked at the U.S. Immigration and Naturalization Service to write a letter on his behalf so that he could help his friends, Mr. and Mrs. Otto Gemeiner. And the letter reads, "Dear Sir, Mr. Herman Fischer, proprietor of the Alt Heidelberg Inc., Detroit, Michigan, has called upon me personally this morning with reference to the immigration of his friends, Mr. and Mrs. Otto Gemeiner. And I desire to state that I have known Mr. Fischer for a number of years, and I know him to be a responsible businessman of this city, amply able to assist any of his relatives who may come from Europe to the United States. His restaurant in Detroit is one of the principal restaurants of the city and has a large patronage. I understand that Mr. Fischer's ownership of the restaurant, along with his other properties in Detroit, constitutes a valuation of $65,000 to $75,000. He also has the Parisian Model Furs Incorporated of Detroit. This fur company is valued at about $20,000 in stock and is owned outright by Mr. Fischer, but I understand that if Mr. Gemeiner is admitted to the US, that Mr. Fischer will give him an interest in the fur business." So again, the recommendation letter is not just attesting to that this person is, in good standing in the community, but here's some information about their financial status and how they'd be able to actually support this family that comes to the US if that family is unable to find work right away. Then you also need a letter from your bank that you would submit. So this letter is for a retired clothing company president, Walter Marks, and he asked his bank in St. Louis, Missouri, to write a letter vouching for his financial stability. And his letter reads, "To whom it may concern, this is to certify that Mr. Walter S. Marks has been favorably known to the officers of this bank for many years. He's always carried a very satisfactory account with our bank and has a high standing in the community. Mr. Marks was president of the Marks and Haas Clothing Company up to the time of his retirement from business in 1930. He's always conducted himself in a manner above reproach and has lived in the community for 62 years. Our records are not burdened with any facts that would reflect unfavorably on Mr. Marks's honesty and integrity. And since 1930, he is not engaged in business." So again, needing a letter from the bank in good standing, but also, how much money you have in your accounts, what else do you have maybe besides just a savings account, are there stocks, bonds, et cetera, to prove that you could take care of this family should you need to. Then you need to submit your tax returns. The sponsor has to submit tax returns showing their annual salary to ensure, again, that you can financially support the prospective immigrants should they not be able to find employment right away. So this return is from a gentleman in New York, Joseph Schwab, and his salary is listed as $16,677, which in contemporary times would be about $300,000. The last step of this particular step 3 is that then you need to have your sponsor submit an affidavit. Each American sponsor has to submit a financial affidavit in which they promise and guarantee that they will receive and take care of the prospective immigrants and will at no time allow them to become public charges to any community or municipality. So part of this affidavit must include listing all of your assets. So things like investments, savings, even life insurance and property. And this document is from Lester Lyons. He was a salesman for a sausage casing company who submitted his financial affidavit to the US government, promising to support his friends Gustav and Greta Weinman and their 2 boys if they were permitted to immigrate to the US. Gustav had fought in the Austrian army in World War I, and he was arrested at Kristallnacht in November of 38 and imprisoned at Dachau concentration camp. The photo here is their passport photo for the family to try and get out. When he served with the Austrian army in World War I, he was a captain and he was injured. So he was given a tobacco company to help him make ends meet because of being injured during the war. He also then became the head of a tariffs department where he worked for a large firm. And then he married his wife, Greta. They had their 2 boys, Ernst and Hans. After his arrest at Kristallnacht and being imprisoned at Dachau, he was released when he told them that he would leave Germany. A lot of the people who were arrested after Kristallnacht would be permitted to get out if they promised that they were going to leave. But he also lost his job at the tariff company then. So knowing that he needed to leave the country, he began making preparations for his emigration, and he sold the tobacco shop in order to pay for the trip. The family left Vienna in November of 39 and traveled aboard a ship out of Rotterdam to New York, going through Southampton, England. So now that you have applied for the waiting list, you've gathered all your documents, you have gotten an American sponsor, now you have to buy your ship ticket. Travel had become very difficult after World War II began in September of 39. You have a lot of the ports closing down. German submarines are also attacking ships out in the Atlantic. American officials required proof that a potential immigrant had already purchased a ship ticket, which could be quite expensive, obviously, but that you would be physically able to leave Europe should they actually admit you. And it was also difficult to purchase your ticket and get that timing balance correct again with gathering up all of the documents, your number on the waiting list, waiting for that interview. and then buying your ship ticket. And of course, if you messed up that timing, that could mean that you're out a great deal of money, and now you have to start the whole process over again. This photo is from the Winter family again, the pen pals, for their ship ticket. And for the family of 4, cost them 1,976 Reichmarks for the tickets, which would be about the equivalent of $14,000. So again, very expensive, just even to get the ticket to get out. And it's not just the ticket that you're going to need for the ship, but you also have to collect transit visas. So this step, like a couple of the others, have multiple steps within it. Potential immigrants needed permission and had to obtain stamps in your passport from any of the countries that you might need to travel through in order to reach the ship's port of departure. So we said a couple of these other families, made their way to Rotterdam and then to England and then to the US. So any places that you were going to be going to in order to get to that ship, you'd need permission to enter. So the stamps need to be collected in a specific order, and each one of those are again going to cost you money. One mistake can send you back to the same government office many times trying to get everything done correctly. And foreign officials were monitoring this very closely because the war is progressing. They don't want people to be entering their country who could obviously be a national security concern, but they also didn't want the Jewish immigrants to somehow get trapped there and all of a sudden become their financial burden to support. So again, there was very close attention paid to who's coming in and for how long. This particular transit visa belongs to a gentleman by the name of Fritz Troyer. And we're going to talk about his family a little bit too. There's a Minnesota connection there with them. So you need the permit stamp. So Fritz Troyer had to go to the Belgian consulate to obtain his transit permit stamp in his passport, which is going to allow him to travel through Belgium to reach the passenger ship that will bring him to the US. He also needs an entrance visa. So the British consulate in Vienna granted Fritz Troyer the visa to enter Great Britain. His visa is granted because he's planning to leave on a passenger ship for the US from the British port of Southampton. Then he needs a landing permit. And this stamp indicates that Fritz Troyer is permitted to remain in Great Britain for less than 2 weeks. So should there be some sort of problem or delay with the ship, he's allowed to stay, but only for up to 2 weeks' time. And he's not permitted to work while he's there in the country. So it's more like, a visitor tourist visa sort of thing, not being allowed to stay and have any sort of employment. So the Troyer family, their young son, Robert, who later goes by the name of Bob, he had given an oral testimony to the museum. And so he talks about how his family was actually able to get out, and Robert, the son, ends up spending the rest of his life later in Minnesota. So he says, from Vienna, my dad Fritz had written to an acquaintance of an acquaintance in New York, asking for help to get an affidavit, a sponsor. And the person that he wrote to, this acquaintance of an acquaintance, had already overextended himself. He'd already helped so many people that his financial statements wouldn't allow him to support anybody else. They would say, nope, in case all of these families can't find jobs, you've already reached the maximum of people that you can help, so you're done. So he's overextended himself, can't furnish any more affidavits, and he didn't know what to do because he wanted to help. So this acquaintance of the acquaintance ends up taking a 3x5 card, and he writes on it, Troyer family in need of sponsorship and affidavit, or something to that effect, that the family was in jeopardy. And he put the card up on a bulletin board of the New York Athletic Club where he was going to a luncheon that day. When he came out of the lunch, the card was gone. Somebody had taken it. He didn't know who, but very quickly, Robert reports that his father, still in Vienna, received proof of the affidavit and the visa, and he went through the visa application process and collected all of his documents. Ultimately, his father, Fritz, got out to England, where the mother, Mia, was already there working, trying to get enough money to get out. They had sent their young son to England, and then he later went to Ireland for safety. So they were all going to meet up in England. And Robert says, there was a long delay for my dad in England because somebody lost his passport there at one of the embassies. But finally, All the papers were gathered and a telegram was sent to me in Ireland to come back to England, and we would make the journey to the US together. He says, we had to board a German ship flying the swastika because that's how they got the last of our money. It was an unpleasant trip, and ironically, the boat was virtually empty. Not because at that time the Nazis wouldn't let you go, it was empty because nobody would let you in. And he says, I think most countries are pretty tight about letting immigrants in. I mean, there are lots of stories about that. And he says, I'm not going to wax metaphysical about the stranger that took the 3x5 card off the bulletin board. He says, I'm not a reader of palms. I don't have God's hand. How do I know? He says, all I know is what the man did. We didn't know who he was. His name meant nothing to us. And when the man who furnished our affidavit did not meet us at the boat when we landed in New York, he had his agent meet us at the boat, and it was late in the night, and he met us very formally. And he explained that Mr. So-and-so was happy to furnish the affidavit and enable us to escape, but expected that we would make no demands on him. And my mother, Robert says, oh, I could see this one coming a mile away. My mother bristled and said it was never our intention to ever make demands on anybody for anything. And thank you very much. We were deeply grateful. We would repay him promptly as soon as we have earned the money for any expenses he's had on us. And Robert says later, in my parents' papers, I found a letter from this man to my parents. It was dated September 1939, a short time after we came to this country. And my parents' first job was scrubbing floors in New York offices on their hands and knees. His father, Fritz, was an academic. His mother was a piano and cello instructor. And here they are scrubbing floors on their hands and knees now in this new country. But they were grateful to have gotten out. The letter said, I'm in receipt of your check for, I think it was $1 and some cents, Robert says. And the gentleman said, I realize how hard it was for you to save this, to spare this money. I never expected any financial reimbursement. I will accept this check as payment in full. And it was signed from Louis Sarnoff, the gentleman that they didn't know who had saved him. Eventually, they became good friends, the person who rescued them and this family. And Robert says, you never know when you reach out to help somebody. You just never know. Well, Robert eventually settles in Minnesota. He had bought a farm just outside of the Leech Lake Reservation area. And he became a high school English teacher in Cass Lake and formed strong connections with the Native American community of Leech Lake. And he was even ceremoniously adopted and given the Ojibwe name, Stands with the Light. He took a new job as the community organizer for the Bemidji office of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And then he later moved to Washington, D.C., where he worked for the Office of Health, Education, and Welfare. He also wrote several books, and he called the North Woods of Minnesota home for over 60 years. He would continue to go back there during the summers, and finally in 1979, he and his wife and their kids settled there permanently rather than just going back from D.C. during the summer. And he proudly announced the birth of every one of his 26 grandchildren with the cry, another victory over Hitler. Sadly, he passed away in 2016 at the age of 89. He also signed up at the age of 17 to go back and fight in World War II. He was actually hoping to go back to Europe and take out some of the Nazis, but instead they trained him to go and he worked in the Philippines instead and was in the Pacific Theater. And he was attending Yale University at the time when he decided to go and enlist in the Army. Well, step 6, now that you've gathered up all of your documents that you needed, was finally you have your interview with the US Consulate. So when your turn comes up from the waiting list, you'd be called in for your interview. The State Department official is going to carefully read all your paperwork, make sure that you're financially stable, that you're healthy, you're not a threat to US security, national security. State Department officials often rejected applicants for economic or national security reasons, or told them that you have to return later with more documents. And many of the documents and transit stamps had expiration dates, so an error with that could set you back months and again cost quite a bit of money. And if you've accomplished all of that, you finally acquire your visa and your journey to the US begins. So if you pass the interview, meaning all your paperwork was also in order, you get the official stamp of a visa in your passport. And you would fill one of the 27,370 quota slots available to potential immigrants that year. So again, just a quick reminder of all the steps that people had to go through in order to get that US immigration visa. And we started with the question of why didn't they just leave? But after seeing everything that's involved to emigrate out of Europe and get to the US, I think the question really becomes flipped, and it's really about how were so many able to get out at all? Because when you look at that list of everything that they needed to accomplish, and they had to do this at a time when their rights are being restricted, when the violence is being amped up against them, the war is taking place, it's incredible that anybody was able to actually get all of the paperwork necessary, pay for all of these fees, and get out and get to the US. And we haven't even talked about what are those push-pull factors. It's not easy to just walk away from everything that you've known from your life, from other family members who maybe aren't ready or willing to make that same step and to leave. And again, we have the benefit of hindsight. We know what the end of the story is going to be. The people who are going through this, many of them perhaps just thought, well, things are bad, but if we just stick it out, I'm sure things will get better. This too shall pass. Or when does it get to that point when you finally realize, no, we absolutely have to go. But at that point, you know, eventually Germany doesn't allow the Jewish people to leave anymore. And even in the beginning, when they did allow people to leave, as one of them said, it was hard to find the other countries who are willing to take you in. So again, it's incredible that this many managed to get out. So when you look at the map, you see about 90,000 made their way to the US, but people also went to Shanghai, China. They're going to Central and South America, places very different from what they were maybe used to in Europe. But again, willing to take that risk and go someplace just to get out. On this last little section, we're just going to read through. These are some diary excerpts from a gentleman by the name of Klaus Langer. He was a teenager in Gleiwitz, Germany, and he began his diary after his bar mitzvah and recorded the discrimination that was unfolding in his town in the 1930s. And he writes in these few excerpts about their efforts to emigrate. So on November 28th, 1938, he says, "Father came home and immediately began work on the emigration process. The only two countries to which Father's pension could be transferred were Chile and Palestine." And I've put the names of the countries that they are trying to go to in blue so that you'll kind of see just how many places they're willing to go to. By his calculation, his income would not be enough to make a living in Palestine. And the question then arose whether he would be able to supplement his pension. There was also the question whether the Nazis would continue to send his pension abroad. As an amateur musician, it was almost impossible to make a living in Palestine because of the many other Jewish musicians who had emigrated there. In Chile, the situation was somewhat better, and it would have been impossible to live there on the pension. Father had to give up hope for emigrating to Argentina. He's now hoping to get a business license for Palestine. It'd be best if we could all go to Palestine. On December 14th, he writes, "According to the new law, Jews are allowed to take only essentials with them when they emigrate. The new regulation requires rehabilitation to the German government for the destruction caused over Kristallnacht." And that's actually a photo of Klaus Langer's diary. December 19th, he says, "Regarding the emigration of my parents, I have the following to report. First came 2 refusals from Argentina for lack of letters of credit. The rich uncle in America is unable to assume such a financial responsibility. We don't have an affidavit for the US. India requires firm employment there or a contract. Father's now trying to make connections in India to obtain a contract. He also wrote to Peru, and he was told to go to the Uruguayan consulate. Allegedly, the Dominican Republic would take 10,000 Jews and provide them with visas. However, nothing further is known about that. It probably makes no sense to turn to them. However, with the Dominican Republic visa, it is possible to get a half-year visa for Palestine. Shanghai also accepts Jews, even without a visa, but it's questionable how one can live there. The mail also brought Jews from Palestine. We had sent requests for commercial certification." On January 5th, he says, "My parents had to all but give up hope for South America. However, India is still an open possibility. If they can get there, it would be very good. Their chances of immigrating to the US also are very slim because they have a very high waiting number, 25,000. On January 12th, "Regarding their immigration, my parents have not progressed one step. As of January 1st, we are required to have an identity card. In providing personal information, the official asked my father's hair color. My father's bald. I must really admire my parents. Despite having been rejected, disappointed, having suffered hardships and daily aggravations, they did not lose their good humor. July 15th, my parents finally have something that might work in regard to their immigration. The Chilean visa costs about 70 pounds, which my parents somehow obtained. Unfortunately, all the ships for Chile are booked until December. However, that still represents a possibility. August 19th, my parents are still trying to get papers for Chile. At the moment, it does not look good. Klaus's parents and grandmother were not able to emigrate out of Germany. His mother died of blood poisoning on September 8, 1941. His father was deported to a camp in Poland in April of 42. By the end of that year, the local Jews from Izbica and those who came there from other locations had been taken to the death camps at either Belzec or Sobibor or had been shot, and Klaus's father was among them. His grandmother was sent to Terezin on July 15, 1942, and only a few months later was deported to Minsk, where she perished. Klaus did emigrate to Palestine, arriving in January of 1940. When we think about his diary entries, and we think about the challenges that his family faced, again, they're willing to go pretty much anywhere, all those different countries that they listed. They were worried about how to support the family, what job could they get in the new country, what would the pension be, but they didn't worry about whether or not they knew the language, what different sort of culture there might be, geography, weather, all these different things that we think about when we think of home, cultural differences. None of that mattered. They were willing to give up everything they knew to be safe and to get out. But again, had a difficult time finding a place that would allow them to leave quickly enough to actually help them. I think it's also interesting to note Klaus's purpose in keeping a diary. Usually we think of a diary as something very personal and sort of emotional. And when we go back to his entry on December 19th, he says, regarding the emigration of my parents, I have the following to report. So for him, it's really about trying to let the rest of the world know what his family went through, and really telling others what exactly was happening. It was more of a report. And just very quickly, I know we've only got a couple minutes left, just to look at some of the numbers. The US didn't used to have this immigration quota back in 1900 to 1915. There were all kinds of immigrants coming into the US, 900,000 on average each year. When World War I takes place, the number drops to about half of that, but it's in 1924 when they decide to put this law in place that's going to then restrict how many immigrants can come in. From 25 to 32, numbers fell significantly because of the new law, plus with the Great Depression going on. In 33, Hitler comes to power and the US quota number is set. But even with that quota number, we let very few people in. You see how many unused visas there were in 1933. And yet there were almost 83,000 people already on the German waiting list for a US visa. And we had almost 25,000 of those visas that just remained unused that we did not grant. From 1934 to 37, we averaged about 7,000 visas per year. And again, 80 to 100,000 on the waiting list. And again, you can see how many remain unused. 1938, again, lots of unused visas. Finally, by 1939, the State Department issued the maximum number of visas available, but look at how many are still on the waiting list. 1940, same thing. 1941, when we actually enter the war, now we get rid of the waiting list altogether. And so really between 1942 to 1945, only 8% of potential immigration was fulfilled. So again, it's not so simple to say, well, why didn't they just leave? It was a very difficult process, and it's really truly amazing how many people were able to get out.
Wow, Kristin. Thank you once again. I mean, this is an incredible, incredible presentation. I'm just stunned at the amount of unused visas. Wow. Okay, for the sake of time, I'm just going to announce tomorrow, November 4th, we have a presentation by Eva Schaller, who is originally from Poland. I believe she's going to be presenting from New York. Her presentation is Holocaust by Bullets. Please join us if you can. And then we posted 2 other upcoming programs. One is next Monday night, November 9th. It's a Kristallnacht commemoration, and the scholar's name is Wolf Gruner, and he comes to us from the University of Southern California. And the other one is November 17th, which is going to be a panel discussion, different disciplines that deal with the Holocaust, history, communication studies, psychology, law, and that is organized by the Upper Midwest Holocaust and Genocide Consortium. You can find everything, information about the programs on our JCRC Facebook. So if you're not part of our Facebook social media group, please join. And again, Kristin, thank you so much. This was an incredible presentation, and we look forward to seeing you the day after tomorrow. Bye, everybody.